I'd always thought of myself as a perceptive man. 38 years old, a decent job in logistics, a modest house in the suburbs, and a marriage that, while not perfect, felt steady. My wife, Emily, was the kind of woman who lit up a room. Blonde hair that caught the sun just right, a laugh that made you feel like you were part of something special. We'd been together for 12 years, married for 9. No kids, just us and our routines. Mornings with coffee, evenings with takeout or her cooking something simple. I trusted her implicitly. Maybe that was my first mistake. It started subtly, the way erosion works on a cliff. Slow, invisible until the edge gives way. She'd always been a social creature, flitting between book clubs, yoga classes, and dinners with friends. I didn't mind. I liked that she had her own life. But somewhere around late fall, I noticed her phone buzzing more than usual. She'd glance at it, smile faintly, and tuck it away. Just a friend, she'd say if I asked, her tone light, dismissive. I didn't push. Why would I? Trust was the bedrock of us. Then came the late nights. She'd started working late at her marketing job, a gig she'd had for years without ever needing overtime. I'd wait up sometimes, scrolling through my phone on the couch, the TV flickering in the background. She'd come home smelling faintly of wine, her cheeks flushed, claiming client dinners ran long. "You know how it is," she'd say, kissing my forehead before heading to bed. I'd nod, sip my beer, and let it slide. The house felt quieter those nights, like it was holding its breath. One evening, I found a receipt in her coat pocket, crumpled, forgotten. A bar downtown, 2 glasses of Pinot Noir, a charcuterie board. Dated for a night she'd said she was at the office. I stood in the laundry room, staring at it, my pulse thudding in my ears. It wasn't proof of anything, I told myself. People have drinks with colleagues. But the seed was planted, a tiny splinter in my mind that wouldn't dislodge. I started paying attention. Her wardrobe shifted, new dresses, tighter, bolder colors. She'd twirl in front of the mirror, asking how she looked, and I'd say beautiful, because she was. But the question felt different now, like it wasn't for me. Her phone stayed glued to her hand, and she'd angle it away when I walked by. Once, I caught her laughing at a text, her fingers flying across the screen, and when I asked who it was, she said, "Oh, just Sarah being silly." Sarah, her yoga friend. I nodded, but something in her eyes, too bright, too quick, gnawed at me. By December, the air in our home felt thick with unspoken things. I'd lie awake next to her, listening to her breathe, wondering if I was imagining it all. I didn't want to be that guy, the paranoid husband, the one who snoops, but the receipt burned a hole in my thoughts. One night, she left her phone on the kitchen counter while she showered. I stared at it, my heart hammering. I didn't touch it, not then, but the temptation was a living thing, coiling around me, whispering that I deserved to know. The holidays came, and with them, a chance to test the waters. We hosted a small party, friends, neighbors, the usual crowd. Emily was in her element, flitting between guests, her laughter ringing out. I watched her, trying to see what I'd missed. She wore a red dress that hugged her curves. Her hair swept up, and everyone complimented her. I did too, but my words felt hollow. I kept an eye on her phone, tucked into her purse by the couch. She didn't check it much that night, but I noticed her glance at it once, her lips twitching into a smile before she turned back to a conversation. One of our guests was Mark, a guy from her office. Mid-40s, tall, with a salesman's charm, too smooth, too loud. He'd been to our house before, but this time he lingered near her. They talked by the kitchen island, her hand brushing his arm as she laughed at something he said. I stood across the room, holding a beer, my stomach tightening. It wasn't overt, just a touch, a look, but it landed like a punch. I told myself I was overreacting. People flirt at parties. It's nothing. After everyone left, I helped her clean up. She hummed to herself, stacking plates, and I asked, casually, "Mark seemed chatty tonight. What's his deal?" She didn't miss a beat. "Oh, he's just Mark. Always telling dumb stories." Her tone was breezy, but she didn't meet my eyes. I let it go, but the splinter grew sharper. A week later I caved. She was out, another late night, and her laptop sat open on the dining table. She'd been working on something, left it logged in. I sat down, my hands shaking, and opened her email. Nothing obvious at first, work stuff, spam, a thread with Sarah about yoga schedules. Then I saw it. An email from M. No last name, a generic address. Last night was fun. Same time Thursday. Sent 2 days ago. My chest constricted. Thursday, she'd said she was meeting a client. I scrolled further. Another. You looked incredible in that dress. My vision blurred. I closed the laptop, my breath shallow, and sat there until she came home. She walked in, cheerful, oblivious. Hey, you're still up, she said, dropping her bag. I nodded, forcing a smile. Long day? I asked. Yeah, exhausting, she replied, heading upstairs. I stayed downstairs, the email searing into me. I didn't confront her. Not yet. I needed more. The next day, I called in sick and drove downtown. I parked near her office, watching from a distance. She left at 5, but instead of heading home, she walked 3 blocks to a hotel bar. I followed, keeping my cap low, my heart pounding. She sat at a corner table, sipping wine. Alone at first. Then Mark showed up. He slid into the seat across from her, his hand resting on hers. She didn't pull away. They talked, laughed, leaned closer. I watched through the window, the cold seeping into me, my world tilting. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, Emily beside me, her breathing soft and even. She'd come home late again, claiming traffic, her voice bright with excuses. I'd nodded, said goodnight, and turned away. My mind replayed the bar scene. Mark's hand on hers, her smile, the ease between them. It wasn't just a fling. It was something deeper, something that mocked every year we'd spent together. The next morning, I dug deeper. Her phone was locked now, new behavior, but I remembered her laptop password from that night. While she showered, I opened it again. This time, I checked her photos. Hidden in a folder labeled work stuff were pictures. Her and Mark at a restaurant, her in a hotel room mirror, him behind her, grinning. My stomach lurched. The dates stretched back months. This wasn't new. It was a parallel life. I copied the photos to a USB drive, my hands trembling. Then I checked her texts, synced to the laptop. Hundreds of messages with M. Flirty, intimate, plans to meet. One from last week. Can't wait to see you in that red dress again. Another. He suspects nothing. We're good. My breath caught. He. Me. The fool. I confronted her that night. She was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables, humming. I set the USB on the counter, my voice steady. What's this, Emily? She froze, her eyes flicking to it. Then to me. What are you talking about? She said, but her voice wavered. I opened my laptop, showed her the photos. Her face drained of color. It's not what you think, she started, but I cut her off. Don't lie. I saw you with him. At the bar. Months of this. She crumpled, tears welling up. I didn't mean for it to happen, she said. It just did. I stared at her, the woman I'd loved, and felt nothing but ice. How long? I asked. 6 months, she whispered. 6 months of lies, of her coming home to me after him. I walked out, leaving her sobbing, my mind already turning to what came next. I didn't go far that night, just to the garage where I sat in my truck, the engine off, the dark pressing in. My hands gripped the wheel, knuckles white, as I processed it. 6 months. Half a year of her building something with Mark while I slept beside her. Oblivious. The betrayal wasn't just the act. It was the secrecy, the laughter behind my back, the way she'd looked at me like I was still her husband while she belonged to someone else. I didn't cry, couldn't. Instead, a cold clarity settled over me. She'd made her choice, and now I'd make mine. Divorce was too easy, too clean. She'd walk away with half of everything. Our house, our savings, our life. While Mark waited in the wings. No, they'd pay. Not with violence, I wasn't that man, but with something sharper, something that cut deeper. I started with Mark. The next day, I called a friend, Dave, who worked IT at a security firm. Over beers, I told him I needed dirt. Nothing specific, just a favor. He didn't ask questions. 2 days later, he sent me a file. Mark's digital footprint. Tax records, social media, a DUI from 5 years back. More usefully, he was married to Lisa, a nurse, 2 kids. His Facebook was full of family photos, all smiles. Hypocrite. I smiled for the first time in days. I tracked Lisa down. She worked at a hospital 20 minutes away. I waited in the parking lot one evening, cap low, until her shift ended. She was petite, tired-looking, her scrubs wrinkled. I approached her, calm, polite. "Lisa, I'm a friend of your husband's. Can we talk?" She frowned but nodded. In a coffee shop nearby, I showed her the photos, Mark and Emily, the texts. Her face hardened, then crumpled. "That bastard," she whispered. I didn't comfort her. I needed her angry. She agreed to help. Not for me, but for herself. We swapped numbers and I drove home, Emily's car in the driveway. She'd been texting me apologies, begging to talk. I ignored her, sleeping on the couch. The next morning I hired a PI, expensive but worth it. He tailed Mark, caught him and Emily at the hotel again, photos and timestamps. Evidence piled up like bricks for a wall I'd build around them. I met Lisa again. She'd confronted Mark, and he'd denied it, gaslighting her until she showed him a photo. He'd stormed out. "He's staying at a motel now," she said, her voice bitter. "Good," I replied. "Let's make it worse." Emily knew something was coming. She'd stopped crying, started pleading. "We can fix this," she'd say, following me around the house. I didn't respond. I'd moved into the guest room, locking the door at night. She'd knock sometimes, her voice soft through the wood, but I'd stare at the ceiling, plotting. The PI's reports kept coming, Mark and Emily meeting less often now, their paranoia growing. They knew I knew, but not what I'd do. Lisa was my ace. She'd filed for divorce, citing infidelity, and sent Mark the photos as leverage. He called her, furious, but she held firm. "He's scared," she told me over coffee. "He thinks you're going to ruin him." I nodded. "I am." She didn't smile, but her eyes gleamed. I dug into Mark's job next. He was a mid-level exec at Emily's firm, a position built on charm and connections. I found his boss's email online, drafted an anonymous tip. "Check Mark Thompson's expense reports. He's been creative." I attached a photo of him and Emily at the hotel bar, timestamped during a client dinner. The PI had more receipts Mark had expensed, dates matching their meetups. I sent it all. 2 days later, Lisa texted, "He's suspended. Investigation started." Perfect. Emily came home that night, pale, frantic. "Mark's in trouble at work," she said, her voice trembling. "Did you do this?" I looked at her, cold. Why would I care about Mark? She flinched, retreating upstairs. I poured a whiskey, savoring the burn. Then I turned to her. I hired a lawyer, started the divorce papers, but that was just the surface. I contacted her HR department. Another anonymous tip. "Emily Thompson's been involved with a colleague. It's affecting her work." I included a photo, a text screenshot. Her job wasn't safe anymore. She'd built her career on reliability. I'd dismantle it brick by brick. By week's end, Mark was jobless, his marriage over. Emily's boss called her in, suspension pending review. She came home sobbing, accusing me of sabotage. I didn't deny it. "You chose this," I said, my voice flat. "Live with it." The trap was tightening, and I wasn't done. The house felt like a battlefield now, strewn with the wreckage of our marriage. Emily barely spoke to me, her eyes red-rimmed, her movements sluggish. She'd been suspended from work, her reputation there teetering on the edge of ruin. I'd heard through the grapevine, friends who still talked to me, that her colleagues were whispering, that the anonymous tip had sparked an internal review. She'd come home that day, slamming the door, her voice breaking as she shouted, "You've destroyed everything." I didn't flinch. "You did that yourself," I said, and turned back to my coffee. Mark's downfall was accelerating too. Lisa kept me updated, her texts clipped and vengeful. His suspension had turned into termination after the company found discrepancies in his expense reports. Thousands of dollars funneled into dinners and hotel stays that weren't for clients. The photos I'd sent sealed it. He was out, disgraced, and Lisa was taking him to court for everything he had left. She'd found a lawyer who specialized in bleeding adulterers dry, and she was relentless. "He's living in a dump now," she told me over the phone. "Serves him right." I watched Emily unravel. She'd stopped dressing up, stopped leaving the house except for necessities. Her phone still buzzed occasionally. Mark, I assumed, but her responses were short, her face drawn when she typed them. I didn't care to look anymore. The PI had enough. Recordings of their calls snatched from public places where they thought they were safe. "What do we do?" she'd asked him in one, her voice trembling. "He's ruining us." Mark's reply was bitter. "He's a psycho. We should have been more careful." I smiled when I heard that. Careful wasn't enough. I started liquidating our shared assets. The house was in both our names, but my lawyer found a loophole. Her infidelity gave me leverage in the divorce. I sold off stocks we'd bought together, transferred the cash to a new account she couldn't touch. She noticed, of course. "Where's the money going?" she demanded one night, standing in the kitchen, her hair a mess. "Away from you," I said, and walked out. She didn't follow. The neighbors started asking questions. I'd kept up appearances, mowed the lawn, waved hello, but Emily's absence was noticeable. "Is she okay?" Mrs. Carter next door asked, her brow furrowed. "She's fine," I lied. "Just busy." The truth was too messy, and I didn't owe anyone an explanation. But the isolation suited me. It gave me space to plan the next strike. I decided to take it public. Not for petty gossip, but for maximum impact. Emily had always cared about her image, how she looked, what people thought. It was her armor, and I'd strip it away. I created a burner email and compiled everything. The photos, the texts, the PI's recordings. I wrote a timeline, clinical and precise, detailing her affair with Mark, their lies, their rendezvous. No embellishments, just the facts, cold and sharp. I sent it to her friends first. Sarah, the yoga buddy she'd used as a cover, got the full package. I included a note. "She lied to you too." Then her book club, her co-workers, our mutual acquaintances. I didn't stop there. Mark's circle got it too. His old college buddies, his golf group, even his parents. I found their emails online, pieced together from social media and public records. The subject line was simple: the truth about Emily and Mark. The fallout was immediate. My phone lit up with texts from people I hadn't spoken to in months. "Is this real? I'm so sorry. She seemed so nice." I didn't reply. Emily's phone erupted too. She stormed downstairs that night, her face pale, clutching it. "What did you do?" she screamed. "Everyone's texting me, asking about Mark." I leaned back in my chair, calm. "I told them what you wouldn't." She threw the phone at me. It missed, skittering across the floor, and collapsed into a chair, sobbing. "You're a monster," she said. I didn't argue. Mark called her an hour later. I heard his voice through the speaker. Panicked. "My mom got an email." "My mom? What the hell is he doing?" Emily's reply was a broken whisper. "He's destroying us." I poured another whiskey, listening. They deserved every second of it. The next day, Sarah showed up at our door, furious. "You used me as an alibi?" she snapped at Emily, who stood there, mute. Sarah glared at me too, but I just shrugged. "She made her bed," I said. Sarah left, and Emily didn't leave the house for days. The public shaming wasn't just chaos, it was a weapon. Her social world collapsed, and with it, any chance of salvaging her dignity. Mark's too. Lisa told me his old friends had cut him off, his reputation trashed. "He's a pariah," she said, satisfaction in her voice. I nodded. Good. Money was next. Emily had always been comfortable. Our combined income gave us a cushion, a life without worry. I take that too. My lawyer was a shark, working angles I hadn't considered. Infidelity didn't automatically sway courts, but it helped. We filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences, and I pushed for everything. The house, the savings, even her car, hers in name but paid for with my bonuses over the years. I'd already moved most of our liquid assets, but the house was trickier. I listed it without telling her, through a realtor friend who owed me a favor. Offers came in fast, it was a seller's market, and I accepted one, cash, below asking but quick. Emily found out when the realtor called to schedule a walkthrough. "You're selling our house?" she yelled, storming into the guest room where I'd set up camp. "It's my house now," I said. "You'll get your share when it's done." She stared, speechless, then left, slamming the door. Her job was gone by then. The HR investigation ended with a quiet firing. Unprofessional conduct, they called it. She'd lost her income, her stability. I drained our joint accounts before she could lawyer up, leaving her with scraps. My lawyer assured me it was legal, barely, and she'd have to fight for anything more. She didn't have the cash or the will. Mark's finances were crumbling too. Lisa's divorce suit was brutal. She'd frozen his accounts, seized his car. The PI found out he'd borrowed from shady lenders to cover legal fees, sinking deeper. I didn't pity him. I pushed harder, tipping off his creditors anonymously about his job loss. They'd hound him now, relentless. Emily tried to fight back, hiring a cheap lawyer with what little she had. He sent a letter demanding half the house proceeds. My shark laughed, filing counters that buried her in paperwork. She couldn't keep up. One night, she cornered me in the kitchen. "I'll be homeless," she said, her voice raw. "You should have thought of that," I replied and walked away. With her world shrinking, Emily became a ghost in our home. She stayed upstairs, emerging only for food or to pace the living room, muttering to herself. I'd hear her on the phone sometimes, her voice low, desperate. Mark, probably, or a friend who hadn't abandoned her. But those calls grew rare. Her isolation was palpable, a void I'd helped create. I moved out, renting a small apartment downtown. The house sale closed, and I pocketed most of it, leaving her a pittance after legal fees. She had 30 days to vacate, court-ordered. I didn't care where she went. Mark, I learned, was crashing with a cousin, his life a shambles. Lisa had the kids, the house, his pride. They were both adrift now, tethered only to their mutual ruin. I kept tabs through the PI. Emily rented a cheap studio, her belongings in trash bags. Mark's cousin kicked him out after a fight, and he ended up in a motel, the kind with flickering neon signs and stained carpets. They met once, a tense coffee shop, sit down, the PI photographed. She looked gaunt, he disheveled. No laughter now, just blame, exhaustion. I framed that photo, kept it on my desk. A trophy. Friends stopped asking about her. My life moved on, work, beers with Dave, a quiet routine. But I wasn't done. I wanted them to feel this forever, a weight they couldn't shed. I started rumors at her old job, subtle whispers through ex-colleagues. "She's unstable." At Mark's golf club, I mailed flyers with his face, the word cheater in bold. Petty, maybe, but effective. They'd never climb back. One night, Emily called. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice small. "I know you hate me." I didn't reply, just hung up. Sorry didn't undo it. Hate wasn't even the word. I felt nothing now, just a grim satisfaction. The endgame was simple. Erase them from any future worth having. Emily's studio was in a rough part of town. Her new reality a far cry from our suburban life. The PI caught her applying for low-end jobs, retail, waitressing. Her resume a sad shadow of her marketing career. She didn't get hired often. Word had spread, her name tainted. Mark fared worse, picking up odd jobs, his charm useless now. They were broken, but I wanted more than broken. I wanted them hollowed out. I found Mark's new weak spot, his kids. Lisa had full custody, but he still saw them weekends. I didn't touch the kids, they were innocent, but I made sure he lost that last shred of fatherhood. I sent Lisa a package. Recordings of Mark ranting about her to Emily, calling her names, plotting to dodge child support. She took it to court, and his visitation vanished. "He's a wreck," Lisa told me. Cried when he heard. I didn't care. He'd built this. For Emily, it was her family. Her parents lived 2 states away, retirees who'd always adored her. I mailed them the dossier, photos, texts, the works with a letter. She didn't just betray me. A week later, she called me hysterical. My mom won't talk to me. What did you do? I stayed silent, let her rant, then hung up. Her siblings cut her off too, the golden child dethroned. They tried to reconnect, the PI reported. A late-night meeting at her studio, both of them drunk, arguing. She blamed him, he blamed me. It ended with him storming out, her crying alone. I watched the footage, their misery a bomb. The final blow wasn't one act. It was the sum of it all, a slow bleed I'd orchestrated. Months later, I saw her at a gas station. Thin, tired, pumping gas into a beat-up car. She didn't see me. Mark, I heard, had left town, chasing rumors of work, his life a drifting wreck. I'd won not with fists, but with precision. They'd live, but not really. And that was enough. The dust didn't settle quickly. It lingered, a haze over my life and theirs. I'd moved into my apartment fully now, a sparse place with bare walls and a single couch, but it suited me. Work kept me busy, the logistics of shipping routes and warehouse schedules a welcome distraction. Friends checked in less often, sensing I'd closed a door they couldn't reopen. I didn't mind. Solitude sharpened my focus. Let me savor what I'd done. Emily's decline was a quiet echo in the background. The PI, still on retainer because I wasn't ready to let go, sent updates. She'd landed a job at a diner, minimum wage, her apron stained with grease. He'd snapped a photo. Her standing behind the counter, eyes down, hair pulled back tight. She looked older, worn, like the last year had carved itself into her face. I studied it, feeling no pity, just a detached curiosity. How far could she fall? Mark's trail was harder to follow. He'd left town, as rumored, bouncing between temp jobs in a neighboring state. The PI tracked him to a warehouse gig, then a gas station, each stint shorter than the last. His social media, once loud with bravado, was dormant. His last post a vague complaint about backstabbers from months ago. Lisa kept me posted too, her voice clipped over the phone. He's behind on child support. Court's after him now. I nodded to myself. Good. I didn't see Emily often, but the gas station encounter stuck with me. I started driving by her diner sometimes, late at night, parking across the street. She'd be there, wiping tables or pouring coffee, oblivious to me watching. It wasn't obsession. It was confirmation. A ritual to remind myself she'd lost everything I'd given her. One night, she glanced out the window, her eyes sweeping past my truck. I held my breath, but she didn't recognize it. I drove off, the cold satisfaction settling deeper. The divorce finalized that spring. My lawyer had crushed hers, a mismatch from the start. I kept the bulk of our assets, house proceeds, savings, even the furniture she'd loved. She got a small payout, enough to scrape by, but not enough to rebuild. The papers came in the mail, and I signed them without ceremony, tossing them on the counter. That chapter was done. Revenge doesn't end with the act. It ripples, reshaping the world around it. I felt it in the silence of my days, the way people avoided mentioning her name. Our old circle had fractured. Some sided with me quietly, others drifted away, uncomfortable with the wreckage. I didn't care. I traded their approval for justice, and it was worth it. Emily's family stayed distant. The PI dug up a call log. Her mother had answered once, a short, tense exchange, then nothing. Her siblings posted photos online, vacations and birthdays, Emily absent from every frame. She'd been their pride, their shining star, and I'd turned her into a cautionary tale. I wondered if they blamed me, but it didn't matter. They'd cut her loose, and that was the point. Mark's kids were his breaking point. Lisa sent me a courtroom transcript. His pleas to see them, denied by a judge who saw the recordings I'd provided. He'd shouted, lost his temper, and been escorted out. He's a mess, Lisa said, her tone flat. Drinking too much. I pictured him alone, bottle in hand, and felt nothing but the weight of my own precision. His ruin was his own, but I'd handed him the tools. I started hearing whispers about Emily too. A coworker at the diner had quit, telling mutual friends she was unreliable, showing up late, distracted. Her landlord complained about late rent, threatened eviction. She was unraveling, thread by thread, and I watched from a distance, the architect of her collapse. One night, the PI caught her outside the diner, smoking, her hands shaking. "She's on edge," he reported. "Looks like she's barely holding it together." I nodded. Perfect. I kept the photo from their last meeting, the coffee shop argument, on my desk. It was my anchor, a reminder of what they'd done and what I'd made them pay. Sometimes I'd catch myself staring at it, tracing the lines of her despair, his anger. It wasn't joy I felt, it was closure, cold and final. Life moved forward, but it wasn't the same. I'd rebuilt mine on my terms, new routines, new habits. Work promoted me, a small bump in pay I didn't celebrate. I bought a motorcycle, something I'd always wanted, and rode it on weekends, the roar of the engine drowning out the past. The apartment stayed sparse. I didn't need much, didn't want the clutter of our old life. Emily's world shrank further. The PI reported she'd lost the diner job, fired after a customer complaint, though the details were vague. She'd moved again, a cheaper place, a room in a boarding house with peeling paint and a shared bathroom. Her car broke down, sold for parts, and she took the bus now, a figure hunched at stops in the rain. I saw her once, crossing the street, head down, a plastic bag of groceries in hand. She didn't look up, and I didn't stop. Mark surfaced briefly. The PI found him in a bar 2 towns over, working as a bouncer, his bulk still intimidating but his eyes hollow. He'd been arrested once, a drunken fight, charges dropped when the other guy didn't press. Lisa said he'd stopped calling the kids, stopped fighting for them. "He's given up," she told me. "You broke him." I didn't reply. Breaking him wasn't the goal, it was the consequence. I started dating again casually. A woman from work, Karen, asked me out for coffee. She was kind, sharp, didn't pry about my past. We talked logistics and bad movies, and I liked her laugh. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something, proof I could move on, that Emily hadn't taken that too. She'd never know, and that made it sweeter. The PI's report slowed. I didn't need them as often. Emily and Mark were shells now, their lives a cycle of survival, not living. I'd stripped them bare, left them with nothing to rebuild on. It was enough for now. A year passed, and the edges of my revenge softened, blending into the fabric of my days. I saw Emily one last time by chance at a grocery store. She was in the checkout line, counting coins for a loaf of bread and a can of soup. Her hair was dull, her coat frayed, and she didn't notice me 3 aisles over. I watched her shuffle out, head low, and felt a flicker. Not regret, but recognition. This was her now, a stranger I'd once loved. Mark's fate trickled in through Lisa. He'd moved again, farther north, working odd jobs, construction, dishwashing, never staying long. His drinking had worsened, landed him in a shelter once when the money ran out. "He's a ghost," Lisa said. "The kids don't even ask about him." I nodded, filing it away. His erasure was complete. Karen and I grew closer. She'd heard rumors about my marriage, pieced some of it together, but never pushed. One night, over dinner, she asked, "You ever think about her?" I paused, fork in hand. "Not anymore," I said, and it was mostly true. Emily was a shadow, a lesson I'd learned and buried. Karen smiled, and we moved on. The PI quit tailing them, nothing left to report. Emily's boarding house became her permanent address, her days a blur of low-wage work and solitude. Mark drifted, a name on unpaid bills and court notices. Their affair, once a fire, was ash, and I'd scattered it. I sold the motorcycle, bought a better TV, settled into a life that was mine alone. I kept the photo, though, not out of spite, but as a marker, proof I'd survived, that I'd won. It stayed in a drawer, unseen but there, a quiet testament to what I'd built from their ruin. 2 years later, I got a call from an unknown number. It was Emily, her voice thin, hesitant. I just wanted to say I'm sorry, she said. For everything. I listened, silent, the hum of my apartment filling the space. I know it doesn't change anything, she went on, but I needed you to hear it. I didn't respond, didn't need to. Take care, I said, and hung up. It was the last time we spoke. Mark died that winter, overdose, accidental or not, in a motel room nobody cared to clean. Lisa texted me the news. No emotion in her words. He's gone. Kids don't know yet. I didn't reply. His end was inevitable. A dot at the end of a line I'd drawn. Emily faded from sight. The PI, out of habit, checked once more. She'd moved again. No forwarding address. A whisper lost in the wind. I didn't look for her. She'd live or she wouldn't, but she was no longer my story. Karen and I got serious. We moved in together, a small house with a yard, a fresh start. She hung pictures, filled the place with warmth, and I let her. The past stayed in that drawer, the photo untouched. I'd avenged myself, rebuilt myself, and that was enough. They'd paid in full and I was free.